Littleton, New Hampshire, 2005. In the shadow of the White Mountains, where autumn painted the maples in shades of fire and gold, 18-year-old Emma Richardson possessed a voice that could make angels weep. Her father, Michael Richardson, a respected contractor who'd rebuilt half the town after the ice storm of '98, told everyone she'd run away with some college boy from Dartmouth. The town believed him for 14 months. They brought him casseroles and offered their prayers, seeing only a heartbroken widower doing his best. But the truth was hidden beneath the very foundation he'd poured with his own hands, in a soundproof room where trust was being systematically destroyed. No one imagined that the man who'd helped rebuild their community was the monster tearing his daughter's world apart. Before I continue, I want you to know, this story comes from a place of understanding the darkness that can hide behind the most familiar faces. It's about secrets that live in plain sight, and the strength it takes to survive the unthinkable. To the congregation of Littleton Community Church, Michael Richardson was more than just a pillar of strength. The 52-year-old contractor carried himself with the quiet dignity of a man who knew the weight of responsibility. After losing his wife, Sarah, to cancer 3 years prior, he'd thrown himself into his work and his faith with an almost monastic devotion. His construction company had a reputation for honest work and fair prices, the kind of business that kept small New Hampshire towns running. On Sunday mornings, he and Emma would occupy their usual spot in the fourth pew, a picture of devoted family values. His weathered hand would rest protectively on her shoulder during prayers, a gesture the community interpreted as fatherly love. They'd nod approvingly, their hearts aching for this good man trying to raise a talented daughter in an increasingly complicated world. But beneath that calloused grip, Emma felt the weight of ownership. His touch wasn't protective, it was possessive. A constant reminder that she belonged to him, that her dreams of studying music at the University of Vermont were nothing more than dangerous fantasies. The sympathy the congregation poured over her father felt like prison bars, each pitying glance another lock on her cage. Emma's world had become divided between two realities. At home, there was the suffocating presence of her father's control, the way he monitored her phone calls, questioned her friendships, and spoke of her mother's memory as if Emma's independence would somehow dishonor it. But in the church choir loft, when her soprano voice soared above the others, she could still breathe. Music was her lifeline, her connection to something larger than the shrinking boundaries of her existence. Her dream of college wasn't just about education. It was about escape. She'd been accepted to UVM's music program with a partial scholarship, but the acceptance letter hidden in her bedroom drawer might as well have been a suicide note for all the danger it represented. The evening everything changed started like any other Thursday choir practice. Emma had been working on a solo piece for the upcoming Christmas service, her voice filling the small sanctuary with a haunting rendition of "O Holy Night." For those few precious minutes, she wasn't Michael Richardson's daughter. She was simply a voice, free and soaring toward heaven. But when practice ended and she gathered her sheet music, she saw him. Michael stood in the back of the church, his silhouette dark against the stained glass. He'd come to drive her home, as always. Nothing unusual about it. Yet something in his posture, the rigid set of his shoulders, filled her with sudden dread. The drive home was silent. He didn't speak, and that was always worse than his words. The silence was alive, pressing against her chest until she could barely breathe. But instead of turning toward home, he pulled into the construction site of his latest project, a new house foundation on the outskirts of town. The headlights cut through the December darkness, illuminating the skeletal frame of what would become someone's dream home. "You've been happy lately," he said, his voice eerily calm. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. What happened next would shatter Emma's world completely, transforming her from a girl with dreams into a prisoner in her own life. But how far would a father's twisted love really go? "I found something in your room today," Michael said, his voice cutting through the December air like ice. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope, her acceptance letter from UVM. Emma's heart plummeted. "Dad, I can explain." "Your mother and I built this life for you," he continued, his words measured and deliberate. "This house, this community, everything we worked for. And you want to throw it all away for what? To run off and become some liberal college girl who forgets where she came from?" The construction site around them felt suddenly menacing. Concrete mixers and steel beams loomed in the darkness like sleeping monsters. This was Michael's domain. He had poured every foundation in this neighborhood, built the very ground people walked on. "I'm not throwing anything away," Emma whispered, but her voice sounded small and lost in the vastness of the night. "Mom would have wanted me to go to college. She always said education was important." Something shifted in Michael's eyes at the mention of his dead wife. The grief that usually softened his features hardened into something else entirely, something possessive and cold. "Don't you dare tell me what your mother would have wanted," he said, stepping closer. "She's not here to want anything anymore. There's only us now, Emma. Only us." Before she could process what was happening, Michael moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who worked with his hands. The chloroform-soaked rag appeared as if from nowhere, pressed against her face with mechanical precision. Her struggles were brief, her trust in him so complete that even in that final moment, part of her couldn't believe this was really happening. The next morning, Michael Richardson walked into the Littleton Police Department, looking like a man at the end of his rope. He had dressed carefully, work clothes that were clean but worn, his face drawn with what appeared to be sleepless worry. To Sergeant Murphy at the front desk, he looked like every other desperate parent they saw too often in small New Hampshire towns. "I need to report my daughter missing," Michael said, his voice cracking with perfectly calibrated emotion. "Her name is Emma Richardson. She's 18. The story he told was a masterpiece of misdirection. There was a college boy from Dartmouth, he explained. Some rich kid with a sports car who'd been sniffing around the local high school girls. Emma had been acting strange lately, secretive. They'd argued about her grades, about her future. She'd stormed out, probably to spite him, probably to prove some point about independence. "These college boys," Michael said, shaking his head with weary disappointment. "They fill these small-town girls' heads with big dreams, make them think their families aren't good enough anymore." Detective Collins, a 20-year veteran who'd seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times, nodded sympathetically. Small-town girl, older college boyfriend, rebellion against family values. It was practically a cliché. The paperwork was routine, the sense of urgency minimal. "She'll come home when reality hits," Collins assured Michael. "They always do. College boys lose interest fast when the novelty wears off." Michael's performance was flawless. He was the concerned father, the single parent doing his best, the victim of an ungrateful daughter's poor choices. The lie was so perfectly crafted that it required no investigation, demanded no deeper questions. Emma Richardson was filed away as a voluntary missing person, another statistic in the endless parade of teenage rebellion. But what happened to Emma after that chloroform-scented darkness would challenge everything the town of Littleton thought they knew about the man who had helped build their community from the ground up. Emma awoke to the smell of damp concrete and sawdust. The darkness was absolute, pressing against her eyes like black velvet. Her head pounded from the chloroform, and for a moment she couldn't remember where she was or how she'd gotten there. Then it all came rushing back, her father's face in the headlights, the construction site, the chemical-soaked rag. She was lying on a thin mattress on a concrete floor. The air was cold and stale, carrying the scent of fresh lumber and old earth. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out the dim outlines of her surroundings. She was in some kind of basement or underground room, with rough concrete walls and exposed wooden beams overhead. "Dad?" she called out, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "Dad, where are we? What's happening?" A single bare bulb flickered on above her, casting harsh shadows across the room. Michael stood in a doorway she hadn't noticed before, holding a plate of food and a glass of water. His face was calm, almost serene, as if this was the most natural thing in the world. "You're safe now," he said, stepping into the room and setting the plate on a small wooden table. "This is where you belong, Emma. Where you've always belonged." The room was larger than she'd first thought, maybe 12 by 15 feet. It was clearly new construction. The concrete was fresh, the wooden supports clean and unworn. This wasn't some forgotten basement or storage room. This had been built specifically for this purpose. Built for her. "This is one of your construction projects," she whispered, the horrible realization dawning on her. "You built this. You planned this." "The Henderson House Foundation," Michael said matter-of-factly. "They're snowbirds. Won't be back until spring. By then, this room will be sealed behind a false wall. No one will ever know it exists." He had thought of everything. The ventilation system hidden behind fake ductwork, the soundproofing built into the walls, the separate electrical connection that wouldn't show up on any building inspector's report. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was a crime of meticulous, terrifying planning. "You can't do this," Emma said, her voice rising with panic. "People will look for me. The police." "The police think you ran away with some college boy," Michael said, sitting down in a wooden chair that hadn't been there moments before. "I told them how you'd been acting out, how you'd been influenced by those liberal ideas at school. They believed every word." The cruelty of it took her breath away. He had destroyed her reputation, made her disappearance seem like teenage rebellion rather than the crime it was. Who would look for a girl who didn't want to be found? "Your mother would be so disappointed," Michael continued, his voice taking on the wounded tone she knew so well. "We raised you to value family, to understand that home is where you belong. But you let those outsiders fill your head with selfish dreams." Emma realized with growing horror that in his twisted mind, he genuinely believed he was saving her, protecting her from a world that would corrupt her, keeping her pure and close to him forever. The man she had loved and trusted her entire life had become her jailer, and he thought it was an act of love. But how long could his perfect plan really last? And what would happen when the walls he'd built around her secret began to crack? Within days of Emma's disappearance, Michael Richardson had transformed from a respected contractor into something even more powerful. A tragic hero. The story of the heartbroken father whose daughter had run off with a college boy spread through Littleton like wildfire, gathering sympathy and support at every coffee shop, church pew, and grocery store checkout line. The Richardson construction truck became a familiar sight in driveways throughout town, as neighbors found excuses to hire Michael for small jobs. Mrs. Patterson needed her front steps repaired. The Hendersons wanted their deck stained before winter. Everyone seemed to have a project that required his expertise, and more importantly, his presence in their lives. "I just don't know how he carries on," whispered Janet Mills to her sister over Sunday dinner. "That beautiful girl, throwing her life away for some boy she barely knows. And poor Michael, trying to hold it together." At Littleton Community Church, Reverend Walsh made Emma's situation a regular part of his prayers, asking the congregation to remember our brother Michael in his time of trial, and to pray for young Emma, wherever she may be, that she finds her way back to the values that raised her. Michael played his part to perfection. He would bow his head during these prayers, his shoulders trembling slightly, with what appeared to be suppressed emotion. After services, he would accept the gentle pats on the back, the whispered words of encouragement, the casserole dishes pressed into his hands by well-meaning church ladies who worried he wasn't eating enough. "Any word from Emma?" they would ask, their voices heavy with concern. "Not yet," Michael would reply, his voice barely above a whisper. "I keep hoping she'll call, that she'll come to her senses. But this boy, he's got her convinced that her family doesn't matter anymore." The lie grew stronger with each retelling. Emma became not just a runaway, but a symbol of everything wrong with modern youth culture. She represented the danger of outside influences, the corruption of small-town values, the ingratitude of a generation that didn't appreciate what their parents had sacrificed for them. Meanwhile, beneath the Henderson House Foundation, Emma's world had shrunk to the dimensions of her concrete cell. Michael visited twice a day, once in the morning before work, once in the evening after dark. He brought her food, emptied the waste bucket he'd provided, and occasionally sat in his wooden chair to lecture her about the importance of family loyalty. "You're learning," he would say, his voice eerily calm in the artificial light. "Learning what really matters. Out there, you were becoming someone I didn't recognize. Selfish. Ungrateful. But here, you can remember who you really are." Emma had tried screaming at first, until her voice was raw and useless. The soundproofing was perfect. Her cries disappeared into the insulated walls like they had never existed. She had tried reasoning with him, pleading, even apologizing for wanting to go to college. Nothing penetrated the wall of twisted logic he had built around his actions. The most terrifying part was how normal he seemed during these visits. He spoke to her the way he always had, with the same paternal tone he'd used when helping her with homework or teaching her to drive. In his mind, this was just another form of parenting, extreme, perhaps, but necessary for her own good. But even the most perfectly constructed lie eventually faces its first test, and for Michael Richardson, that test would come from an unexpected source. How long could he maintain his double life before someone began asking the right questions? The first real threat to Michael's carefully constructed world came from an unexpected source: Emma's best friend, Jessica Walsh, the Reverend's daughter. Unlike the adults in Littleton who had accepted the runaway story without question, Jessica knew Emma better than anyone. She knew Emma had never even kissed a boy, much less run off with some mysterious college student. 3 weeks after Emma's disappearance, Jessica sat in her father's study, her eyes red from crying. "Dad, I need to tell you something about Emma Richardson. Something's not right about her disappearance." Reverend Walsh looked up from his sermon notes, his expression patient but distracted. "Jessica, we've talked about this. Sometimes people surprise us. Emma was going through a difficult time, dealing with college pressures, missing her mother. Sometimes young people make impulsive decisions. But that's just it, Dad. Emma wasn't impulsive. She was the most focused person I knew. And this college boyfriend everyone keeps talking about, he doesn't exist. I was with Emma almost every day. There was no boyfriend." The Reverend set down his pen, giving his daughter his full attention for the first time. Jessica had always been a thoughtful, observant child. If she said something was wrong, perhaps it was worth considering. "What exactly are you suggesting, honey?" "I'm suggesting that maybe Emma didn't run away. Maybe something happened to her. And maybe we should be looking closer to home instead of chasing some phantom college boy." Meanwhile, beneath the Henderson house, Emma had begun to fight back in the only way she could, by refusing to disappear completely. Using a loose nail she'd found, she had started scratching marks into the wooden beam that ran along one wall. One mark for each day, grouped in sets of 7. The primitive calendar was her way of holding on to time, of insisting that her life still mattered. She had also begun to study her prison with the methodical attention of someone planning an escape. The ventilation system Michael had installed to keep her alive might also be her way out. The ductwork was small, but she had lost weight during her captivity. If she could remove the grate and squeeze into the main duct, she might be able to follow it to wherever it connected to the outside world. Michael's routine had become dangerously predictable. Morning visits at 7 a.m. before work, evening visits at 9 p.m. after dark. He always locked the outer basement door behind him, but Emma had noticed that he sometimes forgot to engage the deadbolt on her inner door when he was in a hurry. All she needed was one moment of carelessness, one opportunity. But Michael was beginning to sense that his perfect plan was developing flaws. At the hardware store, Bob Henderson mentioned that he'd driven by his winter house the previous weekend and noticed Michael's truck there on a Sunday. Just checking the foundation before the ground freezes, Michael had explained quickly, making sure everything's settling properly. It was a reasonable explanation, but it reminded Michael that he was living on borrowed time. The Hendersons would return from Florida in March. The house would be completed, the false wall sealed, his secret buried forever. He just had to maintain his performance for a few more months. But as Jessica Walsh continued to ask uncomfortable questions, and Emma continued to plan her escape, Michael Richardson was about to discover that some secrets refused to stay buried, no matter how deep the foundation. Jessica Walsh wasn't the type to let things go. 2 months after Emma's disappearance, she had filled a notebook with inconsistencies in Michael Richardson's story. The mysterious college boyfriend that no one had ever seen. The fact that Emma had been accepted to UVM but never mentioned any boy to her closest friend. The way Michael's grief seemed performative, calculated. "I'm going to the police," Jessica announced to her father over breakfast one February morning. "Detective Collins needs to hear what I have to say about Emma." Reverend Walsh set down his coffee cup with a heavy sigh. "Jessica, you need to be very careful about making accusations against a member of our congregation. Michael Richardson is a good man going through an unimaginable ordeal. What if he's not, Dad? What if everything we think we know about Emma's disappearance is wrong?" Meanwhile, Michael was discovering that maintaining his double life was becoming increasingly exhausting. The constant vigilance required to keep his secret was wearing him down. He'd lost weight, developed dark circles under his eyes, and found himself jumping at unexpected sounds. The town that had once seen him as a pillar of strength now whispered about how grief was taking its toll on poor Michael Richardson. His visits to Emma had become more erratic. Sometimes he would sit in his chair for long periods, staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Other times, he would deliver her food and leave immediately, as if he couldn't bear to look at what he had done. "You're getting thin," he observed during one evening visit, his voice hollow. "You need to eat more." Emma, who had been surviving on crackers and canned soup for weeks, looked up at him with hollow eyes. "I need sunlight. I need fresh air. I need to not be in a concrete box." "This is temporary," Michael said, though his voice lacked conviction. "Just until things settle down. Until people stop asking questions." But things weren't settling down. If anything, they were getting worse. Jessica Walsh had convinced her boyfriend, Tommy Chen, to help her investigate. Tommy was a senior at Littleton High, captain of the debate team, and possessed the kind of methodical mind that could spot logical flaws in any argument. They had started by mapping Emma's routine in the weeks before her disappearance, interviewing classmates, choir members, even the barista at the coffee shop where Emma sometimes studied. Every conversation confirmed the same thing. There was no mysterious older boyfriend. Emma had been focused on college, on her future, on getting out of Littleton. She wasn't the type to throw it all away for romance. "So if there's no boyfriend," Tommy said as they sat in his car outside the Henderson construction site, "then where is Emma Richardson?" Jessica stared at the half-built house, its foundation solid and complete beneath the skeletal frame. Something about the scene bothered her, but she couldn't put her finger on what. Inside that very foundation, Emma was putting the final touches on her escape plan. She had managed to loosen 3 screws on the ventilation grate using the nail she'd found. The ductwork was small, but she had lost enough weight during her captivity that she might be able to squeeze through. If she could reach the main air handler, she might be able to find a way to the outside vent. But as Emma prepared to risk everything on one desperate attempt at freedom, and Jessica Walsh closed in on the truth, Michael Richardson was about to make a decision that would change everything. How far would he go to protect his secret, and what price would Emma pay for his desperation? The breaking point came on a cold March morning when Jessica Walsh convinced Detective Collins to meet her at the Littleton Police Department. She had spent weeks compiling evidence, and her notebook was filled with inconsistencies that even a small-town detective couldn't ignore. "Detective Collins, I know you think Emma Richardson ran away, but I need you to look at this," Jessica said, spreading her notes across his desk. "Emma never had a boyfriend. Not from Dartmouth, not from anywhere. I've talked to everyone who knew her." Collins, who had been dreading this conversation for weeks, reluctantly examined Jessica's research. The girl had been thorough, too thorough for his comfort. Phone records showing no calls to or from any college. School counselor confirming Emma had never mentioned any romantic relationships. Bank records showing no unusual withdrawals that might indicate running away money. "Sometimes people keep secrets, Jessica, even from their best friends," Collins said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then explain this," Jessica said, pulling out a copy of Emma's UVM acceptance letter that she'd found in the high school guidance office files. She was accepted to the University of Vermont with a partial scholarship. Why would someone throw that away for a phantom boyfriend? Meanwhile, beneath the Henderson House Foundation, Emma had worked one of the ventilation screws completely loose. Her plan was desperate but simple. During Michael's next evening visit, she would pretend to be sicker than usual, hoping to throw him off his routine. Then, after he left, she would remove the grate and attempt to crawl through the ductwork to freedom. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Michael arrived for his morning visit clearly agitated, his usual calm demeanor cracked and fraying. He set down her food tray with shaking hands and began pacing the small room like a caged animal. "They're asking questions," he muttered, more to himself than to Emma. "That Walsh girl won't let it go. She's got the detective looking at things that should stay buried." Emma saw her chance. "Dad, I'm not feeling well," she said, making her voice as weak as possible. "I think I might be really sick. Maybe I need to see a doctor." Michael stopped pacing and stared at her with wild eyes. For a moment, Emma thought she saw a flicker of genuine concern, a ghost of the father who had once cared for her when she had the flu. But then his expression hardened again. "No doctors," he said firmly. "No one can know you're here. This is all temporary, Emma. Just until things calm down. Just until people stop caring about where you went." But as he turned to leave, Emma noticed something that sent a chill through her already cold prison. In his agitation, Michael had forgotten to lock the inner door completely. The deadbolt was engaged, but the regular lock hadn't clicked into place. For the first time in months, Emma had a real chance at escape. But she also knew that if she failed, if Michael caught her trying to get out, there would be no second chance. Would her desperate gamble for freedom finally succeed, or would it seal her fate forever? Emma waited until she was certain Michael's truck had pulled away from the Henderson property before making her move. Her hands trembled as she worked the final screw loose from the ventilation grate, the metal rectangle falling silently onto the mattress behind her. The opening was smaller than she had hoped, barely 18 inches square, but months of captivity had left her thin enough that she might just fit. The ductwork was cold against her skin as she pulled herself into the narrow passage. Years of singing had strengthened her lung capacity, but crawling through the tight metal tube left her gasping for air. She followed the duct as it angled upward, her knees scraping against the rough metal seams, her elbows burning from the friction. Behind her, she could hear nothing but the echo of her own desperate breathing. Ahead, she could see a faint gray light that might have been moonlight filtering through an external vent. It was the most beautiful thing she had seen in 14 months. Meanwhile, Detective Collins sat in his patrol car outside the Henderson construction site, Jessica Walsh in the passenger seat. Her persistent questions had finally convinced him to take a closer look at the property where Michael Richardson spent so much time. "I still think this is a long shot," Collins said, but his voice lacked conviction. The inconsistencies in the case had been bothering him for weeks, and Jessica's research was too thorough to ignore completely. "Just humor me," Jessica replied, her eyes fixed on the half-built house. "If Emma really did run away, why does her father keep coming here? What's so important about this foundation?" Inside the ductwork, Emma had reached what seemed to be a junction where several ducts connected to a central air handler. The space was slightly larger here, allowing her to turn around if necessary. More importantly, she could see 3 different routes leading away from her position. One led back the way she had come. Another seemed to angle deeper into the foundation. But the third led upward, toward that precious gray light. She chose the upward path, pulling herself through the metal tunnel inch by painful inch. The light grew stronger as she crawled, and she could feel the faintest whisper of fresh air against her face. Air that hadn't been recycled through her prison for months. Air that smelled of pine trees and approaching spring. The external vent was covered by a metal grate, but years of New Hampshire winters had corroded the screws holding it in place. Emma pushed against it with desperate strength, and after several attempts, the grate gave way, clattering to the ground outside the foundation. For the first time in 14 months, Emma Richardson breathed free air. She pulled herself through the opening and fell to the cold ground outside, her legs too weak to support her weight. The night sky stretched above her, filled with more stars than she remembered existed. But her freedom came with a terrible realization. She was weak, disoriented, and miles from town. And somewhere in Littleton, Michael Richardson was about to discover that his perfect prison had failed. Would Emma find help before her father found her? Or would her desperate escape only lead to a more permanent end to her suffering? Emma collapsed onto the frozen ground outside the Henderson Foundation, her legs unable to support her emaciated frame. The March air bit through her thin clothing, but after 14 months of recycled basement air, even the cold felt like freedom. She tried to stand, to run, but months of captivity had left her weak and disoriented. Through the darkness, she could see lights, headlights from a car parked near the construction site. For a terrifying moment, she thought it might be Michael returning early. But as her eyes adjusted, she recognized the outline of a police cruiser. Detective Collins and Jessica Walsh had been sitting in the patrol car for 20 minutes, debating whether to call for a search warrant, when they heard the metallic clatter of the ventilation grate hitting the ground. Collins reached for his flashlight, sweeping the beam across the foundation until it found something that shouldn't have been there. A figure crawling out of what appeared to be solid concrete. "Jesus Christ," Collins whispered, his hand moving instinctively to his radio. "Jessica, stay in the car and call for backup. Call for an ambulance too." But Jessica was already out of the vehicle, running toward the collapsed figure. "Emma! Emma Richardson!" The girl on the ground looked up with hollow eyes that took several seconds to focus. Her hair was matted, her skin pale and drawn, her clothes hanging loose on a frame that had lost dangerous amounts of weight. But it was unmistakably Emma Richardson, the missing girl the entire town had given up for dead. "Jessica." Emma's voice was barely a whisper, cracked from months of disuse, except for the songs she had hummed to herself in the darkness. Is it really you? Detective Collins knelt beside Emma, his mind reeling from the implications of what he was seeing. This wasn't a runaway who had come home. This was a victim who had escaped. Emma, we're going to get you help. Can you tell me who did this to you? Emma's eyes darted toward the construction site, then back to Collins. My father, she whispered. Michael Richardson. He built that room. He kept me there. He told everyone I ran away, but he kept me in a concrete box underneath this house. The words hit Collins like a physical blow. Michael Richardson, the grieving father, the respected contractor, the man the entire community had rallied around, was not a victim. He was a perpetrator of unimaginable cruelty. As sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, Emma Richardson had finally spoken the truth that would shatter Littleton's comfortable assumptions about the monsters that lived among them. But Michael still didn't know his perfect prison had been breached. And when he discovered Emma was gone, what desperate measures would he take to protect his secret? Michael Richardson arrived at his small house on Elm Street at 9:30 p.m., carrying a thermos of soup and a fresh loaf of bread from the grocery store. It was his routine, dinner for Emma, delivered like clockwork every evening for the past 14 months. He had no way of knowing that at that exact moment, his daughter was sitting in a hospital bed 3 miles away, giving her statement to a room full of detectives. He parked his truck in the driveway and walked around to the back of the Henderson property, using the key he'd had made months ago. The construction site was dark and quiet, exactly as it should be. He descended the basement steps with the practiced efficiency of someone who had made this journey hundreds of times before. But when he reached the hidden door behind the filing cabinets, something was wrong. The ventilation grate lay on the floor beside Emma's mattress, its screws scattered like metallic breadcrumbs. The concrete cell that had been his daughter's world for over a year was empty. Emma, he called out, his voice echoing in the small space. Emma, where are you? The silence that answered him was different from the usual quiet of his visits. This wasn't the silence of submission. It was the silence of absence. His perfect prison had been breached, his secret exposed to the world above. Michael's mind raced through the implications. If Emma had escaped, she would go to the police. She would tell them everything. His carefully constructed life, his reputation in Littleton, his freedom. All of it would crumble in a matter of hours. He ran back to his truck, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the keys. He needed to think, to plan, to find a way out of this nightmare. But as he backed out of the driveway, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Police cars. Not just 1 or 2, but half a dozen cruisers racing through the streets of Littleton, with their lights flashing and sirens wailing. At the hospital, Emma's medical examination had revealed the full scope of her ordeal. Severe malnutrition, vitamin deficiencies from months without sunlight, and psychological trauma that would take years to heal. But she was alive. She was safe. And most importantly, she was talking. Detective Collins coordinated the manhunt from the hospital corridor, his radio crackling with updates from officers throughout Grafton County. Michael Richardson's truck had been spotted heading north on Route 3 toward the Canadian border. Every state trooper, local police officer, and sheriff's deputy in northern New Hampshire was now looking for the man who had terrorized his own daughter. He's running, Collins told Jessica Walsh, who had refused to leave Emma's side. But he won't get far. We've got roadblocks set up from here to the border. Jessica squeezed Emma's hand as her friend drifted in and out of sedated sleep. You're safe now, she whispered. You're finally safe. But Michael Richardson wasn't done fighting yet. As police cars closed in around him on the dark New Hampshire highway, he was about to make one final, desperate decision that would determine whether Emma's nightmare truly ended or whether it would haunt her forever. The roadblock on Route 3 appeared in Michael Richardson's headlights like a wall of flashing red and blue. State troopers had positioned their vehicles across both lanes, their spotlights cutting through the March darkness. Behind him, more police cars were closing the distance, their sirens wailing through the night air. Michael pulled his truck to the shoulder and sat motionless for several seconds, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. Through his rearview mirror, he could see officers approaching on foot, their weapons drawn but held low. This was it, the end of 14 months of perfect deception. "Michael Richardson, step out of the vehicle with your hands visible," came the amplified voice through a police loudspeaker. For a moment, Michael considered running. There was forest on both sides of the highway, dark woods, where a man who knew construction and outdoor survival might disappear for days or weeks. But he was 52 years old, out of shape from months of stress, and surrounded by trained officers who knew these mountains better than he did. He opened the truck door and stepped out slowly, his hands raised above his head. The March air bit through his work shirt, but he barely felt the cold. All he could think about was Emma's face when she had looked at him through the ventilation grate, not with love or trust, but with the hollow eyes of someone who had been systematically broken down. "Turn around and walk backward toward the sound of my voice," commanded Sergeant Martinez of the New Hampshire State Police. Michael complied, moving with the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions. As handcuffs clicked around his wrists, he felt a strange sense of relief mixed with crushing despair. The performance was over. The mask had finally slipped completely away. At Littleton Regional Hospital, Emma watched the arrest unfold on the local news from her hospital bed. Detective Collins had made sure she could see it. Closure, he called it. The man who had stolen 14 months of her life, who had built her a concrete tomb and called it love, was now just another criminal in handcuffs being loaded into a police cruiser. "How do you feel?" Jessica asked, squeezing her best friend's hand. Emma was quiet for a long moment, watching as the news cameras captured Michael's perp walk. "Empty," she said finally. "I thought I'd feel angry or scared or vindicated, but I just feel empty." The investigation that followed would reveal the full scope of Michael's deception. Hidden beneath the Henderson House Foundation, forensic teams found Emma's primitive calendar scratched into the wooden beam, over 400 marks representing the days stolen from her life. They found evidence of the systematic psychological abuse, the calculated isolation, the theft of her future that had been disguised as paternal protection. But most importantly, they found something Michael never expected them to discover: Emma's voice. Even in that concrete prison, even after months of captivity, she had never stopped singing quietly to herself. And in her survival, in her escape, in her refusal to disappear completely, she had found a strength that no prison could contain. Would Emma Richardson truly be able to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her? Or would Michael's final, most lasting prison be the one he had built inside her mind? 2 years after her escape from the concrete tomb beneath the Henderson House Foundation, Emma Richardson stood in the choir loft of Littleton Community Church for the first time since her disappearance. The same sanctuary where she had once felt trapped now offered her something she thought she had lost forever: the chance to sing again. Michael Richardson had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The trial had been a media sensation that brought national attention to the small New Hampshire town. But Emma had testified with a quiet strength that surprised everyone, including herself. She spoke not as a victim, but as a survivor who refused to let her father's twisted version of love define the rest of her story. "I spent 14 months in that room," she had told the packed courtroom, her voice steady and clear. "But I never stopped being Emma Richardson. I never stopped dreaming of this moment, when I could stand up and tell the truth about what happened to me." The University of Vermont had held her scholarship, and she had started classes in music education that fall. living in a dorm room with windows that opened to fresh mountain air, surrounded by friends who saw her as more than her trauma. She was slowly rebuilding the life that had been stolen from her. Jessica Walsh, now her roommate, and still her closest friend, sat in the front pew as Emma prepared to perform her first solo since the rescue. The song she had chosen was Amazing Grace, not because it was easy, but because it represented everything about her journey from darkness into light. As the opening notes filled the sanctuary, Emma closed her eyes and felt the familiar sensation of her voice soaring above the congregation. But this time, it wasn't an escape. It was a homecoming. Her voice was different now, deeper and more textured by suffering, but also stronger for having survived. The congregation listened in reverent silence as Emma sang about being lost and found, about blindness giving way to sight. Many had tears in their eyes, remembering the bright girl who had disappeared and marveling at the strong woman who had returned. When the last note faded into the rafters, the silence stretched for several heartbeats before breaking into sustained applause. Emma opened her eyes and saw the faces of her community, not with pity, but with admiration and love. After the service, Reverend Walsh approached her with a gentle smile. "Emma, that was beautiful. Your voice, it's even more powerful than before." "It should be," Emma replied, her own smile breaking through. "It's been through hell and back." As she walked out of the church that morning, arm in arm with Jessica, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced in over 2 years: complete freedom. The concrete walls that had once defined her world had been replaced by endless sky. The man who had claimed to love her so much that he had to imprison her was locked away, and she was finally, truly free to become whoever she wanted to be. Her voice had returned, stronger and more beautiful than ever, and with it had returned her hope, her dreams, and her unshakable faith that even the darkest prisons could not contain the human spirit forever. Emma Richardson was no longer a victim of her father's twisted love. She was the author of her own story, and she was just getting started.